Okay, today we are coming back to the topic of Emmanuel, and this picture is meant to scare you, because if you lived somewhere in the Midwest and you saw this, you walked out your house and saw this, you'd probably get in your pickup truck and go the other way, because this is a crazy storm-spawning kind of front, and it's just, when you see this in the sky, it is just so big, it just makes your knees tremble. That's going to be really helpful for us today when we talk about Emmanuel. Really? Yeah. So just store that picture away. Let me catch you up to what we've been talking about so far with Emmanuel. This is actually part 3 on an Emmanuel series. And I told you in Emmanuel, written in Hebrew, that's it down there. You read it from right to left. The words God with us, actually you have to read the other way when you read the word Emmanuel. It's with us, God. With im just means with. You put a first person plural suffix on it and for us. That's the Immanu. And then the L on the end is God. So Emmanuel, literally, you're speaking Hebrew when you're saying Emmanuel. It's with us, God. And so that's what we're looking at. And what I wanted to impress on us is the fact that although it shows up on Christmas cards so casually, Emmanuel, God with us, it's an astonishing issue. So I'm trying to build back in our thinking how astonishing this actually is, Emmanuel, and how it's not just relegated to Christmas. And so that's what we've been looking at as we've been going along. So this is my way of saying Emmanuel, it's not just for Christmas anymore, because Emmanuel is actually a topic that starts from Genesis and goes to Revelation, not just Christmas, although Christmas is a big one. So I started out talking about the creation of the universe. So here's God, creator. This is a picture from the James Webb Telescope. And this is a section, they call it the cliffs of something, I forget now, but it's the Carina Nebula. This is a real picture of real space. I mean, if you get a good enough satellite kind of based telescope up there, this is what you see. And the orange stuff in this picture, those are gases that are actually just sort of swirling around, and eventually the gravitational forces will suck them together and make a star. But you can actually see past this gaseous nebula, and you can look and see the stuff behind it. So the issue is that when you look at stuff like this with awe and wonder, you realize, God might be bigger than the universe, which he is. He's bigger than the universe. He's made the universe. So it's crazy talk almost to say that the God who made all of this actually wants to be with us. That's just a crazy thing. So when you talk about Emmanuel, it's more of what I call a God-focusing process, where the big God actually decides to focus himself on a spot, and in this case, on the earth. It's kind of like, when I was a kid, I would get those magnifying glasses when the sun in the summertime, and I'd burn leaves and stuff like that, or bugs. But I'd use this, and these magnifying glasses didn't really... they weren't really the power source. They were actually the power source. The sun still stayed the sun, but I used it to focus this gigantically powerful thing onto a point. Well, Emmanuel is kind of like that. The concept of Emmanuel is here you have this gigantic, all-powerful God who's bigger than the universe, more powerful than even the mountains that reside just behind us here. He's bigger than all of that, and yet in all of that, this gigantic dimension of God wants to live with us. That's why Emmanuel is just such a crazy idea, but it's also a persistent idea through the Bible. So what we looked at for the last couple of weeks is the fact that this God who is omnipresent, he's ever in the universe, Emmanuel is his perceivable presence. He chooses to be perceived, to be seen in our presence with us, but it doesn't stop the actual larger reality that he's omnipresent anyway. He's everywhere. He's here. And in fact, we saw when Paul was talking in Athens about the fact, he's talking to the Athenians philosophically about who Jesus is, and philosophically about the fact that God created the universe and he created all men on it. And the hopes from God's perspective is that God will be found by mankind. And Paul says, even though he's not far from any of us. That's the omnipresent idea. So why is Emmanuel different? Why is God with us different when actually, in reality, he's omnipresent anyway? Well, he focuses in specific spots so he can be understood, perceived. So today we're using this Emmanuel idea with this subtitle. Emmanuel is the perceivable presence of an omnipresent God. That's what we're talking about. So when we looked at the timeline of humanity coming off of Earth, and here's the timeline of all humanity from Earth, all the way from the Alpha to the Omega, which is what Jesus said he is in Revelation. I'm the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. Throughout the entire timeline, where do we see Emmanuel? Is it just on Christmas Day, or is it throughout the timeline? So we looked at stuff. We looked at basically when you look at the Alpha end and you look at creation, we saw him there in the garden walking with Adam and Eve. That's God with us, for sure. Well, yeah, until the moment of the fall. And on the Omega end of the spectrum, we have him there because we looked at Revelation, where, again, we're returning back to the original intention of God's creation and God's creation of mankind, to be with him. So remember when Jesus was there with the apostles near the end of his life, and he announces to them in John 13, he says, well, I'm going someplace you can't go. And they all freak out, right? And then he says a very famous thing. He says, I'm going to make a room for you, and why? So that where I am, you may be also. So the plan for God for all eternity, as well as starting in the Garden of Eden, this God who made this universe that we're just beginning to understand with James Webb Telescope, this God's intention is that we would live with him. That's the intention. That's Emmanuel, and God is with us. Now, we looked a couple weeks ago at the patriarchs, we call them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Was Emmanuel with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He was. In fact, Jacob wrestled with him and said he wrestled with him all night long, to the fact at which he is amazed by the fact that he wrestled with God. He was with him face to face all night long, and he didn't die because, according to the teachings, if you see the face of God, you'll die because of your sinfulness. He's amazed by that. So he calls the place where he's wrestling with God Penuel, which means face to face with God. But I lived. So yeah, Emmanuel, in terms of the literal meaning, God with us, definitely there. Today we're going to scoot down the timeline just a little bit more, and we're going to go to the time of Moses. And we're going to see if God is with Moses. What is Emmanuel in the time of Moses? And I think we'll be kind of shocked. Now, this is stuff that you probably know, but I just want to impress on you, it's an astonishing aberration on the natural things in the universe that the God creator wants to be with us. And with Moses, he definitely was. So let's just take a look. So here we are. We're leaving Egypt, right? Remember, the Israelites are in Egypt. They're there for like 4 centuries. They're pretty, they're integrated into society, but things become very bad. They start from being favored guests at the beginning of the 4 centuries to being slaves at the end of the 4 centuries. God gets them out of there through the use of Moses, who had pretty much said, I'm not going back there ever again, but God takes them back, uses Moses to bring them out of that captivity. And now they're in the desert. So now they're going to journey through the desert, a place that they have really never been before, because they've been residents of Goshen. They've been residents in Egypt, of a wonderful fertile area. And now, boom, you're out in the desert, and Moses is saying, God's going to take us to a great place. This is actually a nomadic tent. Today is the first time I counted beds in here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 beds in this tent. Yeah, for a whole family. So this is a Bedouin tent that you can find in the Saudi area. So anyway, it looked very much like this. And in fact, the roof was made out of goat's hair. Really? Yeah. I went to Israel once, and they took us out to a place that they call the Tent of Abraham, where they do recreations. They do stuff because you're in Israel and you want tourist stuff. So they took us out in the middle of nowhere. It looked just like this, on camels. They took us about half a mile on the back of camels, which is an interesting experience. Never mind. But anyway, we went out until we got to a whole bunch of tents just like this. And then we went out there, we went under the tents, stinking hot, really, really hot. And as we stood under these tents, which were basically 5 feet high, and I'm 6 feet tall, so I'm inside this tent like this. The roof on this tent is scorching hot. I mean, it's really hot, and it also smells funny. And so I'm like going like this while this guy's talking in the tent about the history of Abraham and stuff. And it was really goat's hair. They had actually made a real goat's hair roof. Yeah. Yeah, don't brush up against it with your head, or your head will smell like goat's hair for the rest of the day. But anyway, this is where they are. So I'm just setting it up for you in Moses' time. So they've left Egypt. They're in the desert. And then God asked for them a remarkable thing, an Emmanuel kind of thing. So let's just pick up the story. We're going to pick it up in Exodus 25. They're in the desert. And so the Lord said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel that they take from me a contribution. That's like a donation thing. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution from me. And this is the contribution that you shall receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, and more. And it goes on and on. So they're out in the middle of the desert, and God says, Moses, you need to go to my people and do a collection. And it's got to be gold and silver and precious stuff. Well, like, why? We don't have anything to spend. God, you need this money to spend on something? Well, you find out as you go on that this is building materials. This is not money. This is building materials. And by the way, and we'll look at it in a second, by the way, how did they have gold and silver in the desert if they've been slaves for generations? When they left Egypt, the Egyptians were so tired of them, they said, here, take this and get out of here. So they left Egypt. They basically plundered Egypt. At Egypt's request, they plundered Egypt with gold and silver and precious stuff because the Egyptians were just so tired of the God of Israel who brought 10 plagues. Now I remember. Yeah, so that's where that was. So they do have this stuff. So here they are in the middle of the desert in goat's hair tents, sitting on sand, and God says, I need your gold, I need your silver. It's not compulsory. See what he says right there? It's not compulsory. From every man whose heart moves him. So if they're moved to do this, I need this out here in the middle of nowhere. For what? For what? Well, for this what is what we're talking about. Still in chapter 25. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. And exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of this tabernacle and all its furniture, so you shall make it. And after this point, in fact, God tells them how to make this God tent for them in specific detail. It's 6, 7, 8 chapters of Exodus. He tells them, it's excruciating detail. And by the way, it takes a lot of gold and silver. And I'll show you one reason why in a second. Why would a tent need gold and silver? A tent need gold and silver? A tent for God need gold and silver? Yeah. But this is what I want to look at right here. Have them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. So here God has told them, leave Egypt, go across the desert sands, and I'll take you to the promised land. And while you're in the midst of your tents going across this desert, I want to camp with you. I want to dwell with you. And I want to dwell with you in a sanctuary, in a tent, in a tabernacle is what it was called eventually. I want to be in the midst of you. I want to dwell with you. Now, this is really kind of an odd thing because what should have happened if I was writing the Bible is I would send Moses back to Egypt. He would be very charismatic. He'd draw the people out of there. He'd do the 10 plagues for God. They'd do all the stuff. They'd just march across the desert. They'd go into the promised land. And the people are just following Moses because, after all, Moses was instrumental in leaving Egypt. Why do something really kind of radically supernatural and have God have a tent in the middle of this? Why? Well, it's actually pretty clear so that the people would understand that it's not Moses that's leading them. It's God that's leading them. So God says, make me a tent like you guys have these kinds of tents. I want a tent in the middle of your tenting. I want to go with you through this entire process. He wants to dwell with them. So this indeed is God with us, the perceivable presence of an omnipresent God. This is God with us. And so they could say every single day as they're in the desert, we're out here with our families in our tribes, but God has his tent right over there. He's with us. He's with us. And not only that, he designed the tent structure of his tent, and it's a lot smaller than you would think it would be because you had to get up and pack it. There's a whole bunch of clans inside the Levite tribe, but their whole job was just to pack this baby up, tote it through the desert, and unpack it and set it up again. That's what they did over and over as they went. And God had very specific ideas about how this was supposed to be, and everything in the design of God's tent is symbolic and instructional in some way. There's something about this tent. As they would be in their tents, remember the 7-bed tent? They would be in their tents, and they'd look at God's tent, and they'd say, there's something different about God's tent. There's something that reflects something about his nature in his tent. We need to take note of this. Not the least of which was artwork of angels and so much more. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. If you don't know what I'm talking about, read those chapters in Exodus after Exodus 25 and ask yourself, as God is stating, my tent needs to be like this. And ask yourself, well, what is he teaching us about himself? Because people always say people know who you are by the condition of your house. Oh, no. Well, okay. But you know what I mean. You see someone's house, you really do understand a lot of the good and a lot of the bad. I mean, that's them. Well, God wants to use his house, his tent, as he tents with them. As Emmanuel, God with us, is in their midst. The tent teaches them something remarkable about who God is. And if you go to Israel, you can actually go to a recreation, and there it is. This is a recreation that's out in the desert in Israel. And I've been to Israel 4 times, and I've always tried to get here, and I've never been able to get here because it's in the boonies. It's way out in the middle of nowhere. But this is a life-size replica of the actual thing, built exactly according to the 6 or 7 chapters in Exodus, and not quite in the same area, but it's in a bad area. It's in a bad area. But when you look at it, you realize, it's not that big. It's pretty remarkably small. Now, when you get to the time of David and Solomon, and they find themselves there in Jerusalem finally, David has this thing. He says to God, look, God, you're still living in a tent. We've moved here to Jerusalem and we've built ourselves limestone houses. God, you need a real house. Here we are in permanent residences in Jerusalem, and God, you don't have a permanent residence. You still have a tent on the corner over there. I'm going to build you a real house. And God says, nope, you're not. Your son will, Solomon will, which it does, that Solomon does. But in that conversation, God says to David, you want to build me a house? Actually, David, I'm going to build you a house. And David's confused in the conversation. And God's talking about the house of David, that is the lineage, the descendants of David, the house. I'm going to build you a house. And from your house will come one who is the Messiah, Jesus. You have to read about that. But anyway, this is the tabernacle. This is very close to what they'd see as they were tenting through the desert. And they could look and say, here's my tent. Here's the tent of our neighbors, the Cohens. Here's the tents of our neighbors, the Goldbergs. And then right over there, that's God's tent. He's right with us. God is with us as we've come out of Egypt. Who needs Pharaoh when God's living in the middle of our camp? Now, he actually did live in the middle of their camp because there was a specific instruction that came. You can read about it in Numbers where God says, I want to be in the middle of your camp when you camp in the desert. And oh, by the way, those who are going to come and camp around me, because I want to be in the midst, God with us. Specifically, the tribes had to line up like this. So you find out in Numbers 2 that if there were 3 tribes that would settle to the east side, that's in fact the direction that the opening of the tabernacle faced was east. To the east, you'd have Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, those 3 tribes. If you're on the south side and you're camping over there, God says have Reuben, Simeon, and Gad, those tribes. If you're on the west side, it says in Numbers 2, then we'll let Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then, of course, if you're on the north side of where God lives, then we'll have Dan, Asher, Naphtali. And then the Levites in purple there surrounded the entire tent of God because they served God. Okay, this was the layout. This was the divine layout. You can read about it in Numbers 2. So when God says, I want to be in your midst, literally, he's in their midst. So everywhere where they camped, where they got up and moved, they would look and there would God be in their midst. There would God be in their midst. So this is literally Emmanuel. This is God with us. So if a stranger walked up to him and said, who are you guys? Well, we're the Israelites. Do you have a God? Yes, we have a God. Tell us about your God. Well, he lives right over there. He lives right over there. But now the Jews had an interesting distinction when you talk about where God lives. And this isn't a very accurate distinction. It's not as though God is contained in that tent. The fullness of God is contained in that tent. It's the fact that this is where God makes himself known in our midst. Because after all, when we talk about Emmanuel, we're talking about the fact of a perceivable presence in the midst of them. So this is why God said, I want to build me a sanctuary because I want to dwell in your midst. Now, when he built the sanctuary, God also said, this is where you're going to do sacrifices for sin. Why would God's tent have an issue about sin with it? And these are a lot of the ahas that come when you start looking at this. Why not just have God's tent be a tent? Why are there sacrifices at God's tent in the middle of the camp? Does that make any sense? I mean, we're just going from Egypt to the promised land. Why? Well, again, as you start to extrapolate and see God's presence and what it does, you realize that God's saying in very clear language that although my desire, God says, is to live in your midst, to dwell with you, you guys have a problem of sin. And I have a hard time, God says, living in your midst and be in such close proximity, because I'm a holy God who sin less, and you, although you're my people, you're a fallen people. So we have to deal with the reality of living in each other's presence with you being rebelliously sinful. And so part of God's tent is about dealing with the perennial nature of sin in people's lives. It's an amazing thing. So here we talk about God with us, but there's a tension because of sin that comes up that's really clearly perceived in the design and structure of God's tent in their midst. God indeed wants to be Emmanuel and live with them, God with us. The problem is we all smell bad. If you know what I mean, symbolically speaking. We have a problem of sin. So this, in fact, this is the tension of the entire timeline of humanity. Here's God from the beginning of end of humanity saying that his desire and his intention and his delight is to live in the midst of his creation of mankind. However, because at the very beginning over there, because of the fall in the garden, man stiff-armed God and said, no way, I don't want to be part of that plan. But then in the end of all time, that is fixed through what Christ has done for us. So here's the tension. A God who wants to be Emmanuel, who wants to be with us, delight us with his presence. Mankind who collectively stiff-arms God through sin and says, I don't want any part of that. But then that's rectified through what Christ does. And in the end of the story, in the age to come, that's where we have the fullness of God and man living in close proximity. And in the interim time, the time we're in right now, there's another twist to that. And we'll see that in just a second. So this is literally Emmanuel right there. So when we talk about Christmas Emmanuel, we should put a tent like this in the middle of the picture. Because this is one of the first kind of incarnations in that sense. Okay, there's another twist to this, which is why I showed you the cloud picture. And this is actually not a faked picture. This is a picture of a tornado in the Midwest that has lightning climbing down the spout. I'll tell you, this is one, if I saw this as I stepped out on the porch, I'd get in the pickup truck and go the other way. I mean, it's scary. It's scary. I've never seen a tornado live. Has anyone ever seen a tornado live? Whoa! Yeah. Was it terrifying? The power. I mean, I just see movies and it just blows me away. Well, they had a similar thing when they're in the desert. And this is my closest representation of what they experience. Not just God with us in his tent. We have our tent. God has his tent in our midst. But to kind of, double the effect of the fact that God is with us, there's this cloud thing. So, I mean, let's read about this, because this was coupled together with the tabernacle tent. So Exodus 33, they're in the desert still. So when Moses entered the tent, this is God's tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. It's kind of like he goes in the front end of the tent, and then God closes the door behind him with this cloud, like, you're staying until we finish what we got to talk about. Door's locked behind me. So God comes to that entry. And when all the people saw that the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship each at his tent door, at his own tent door. And thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, Emmanuel, as a man speaks to his friend. And when Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Okay, this is crazy. I thought God just wanted a tent in the middle of the desert. Well, he does, and to signify his presence with them. But he also has this cloud thing that looks kind of like a tornado, but without the deadly winds, I hope. I don't know. But it's a cloud. It's a pillar that goes up into the sky. And of course, figuratively speaking, heaven was always up, right? We speak like that today. Heaven's always up. There are multiple words for heaven that was used in Hebrew, signifying different levels of up. There's the levels where the birds fly. That was called heaven. because it's unattainable for us. We can't get to that area because only birds can. Then there's an area of heaven that would signify the things above the birds, which would be where you would see the sun, the moon, and the stars. We can't get to there either. That's one step closer to where figuratively God is. And then you talk about heaven in terms of where God lives outside of all that. So there was always this kind of layered idea of what heaven is. Heaven is toward God where you cannot go. And that's not a bad distinction. But it started with the birds, goes to the stars and the sun, and then it goes to where God actually is. So this pillar of cloud draws a direct line between where our feet are on the ground for the Israelites and where God is in his direction. I mean, it was like a pointer. It was like a gigantic pointer pointing to, I'm in your presence. And do you know where this pillar of cloud that draws a straight line between earth and heaven, where it settles down on? Right on his tent. Is God home? Hold on. Yeah, he's home. He's here. He's with us. He's with us. Emmanuel, God with us. Wow. Yeah, God with us. And throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. It gives me goosebumps to think about this. We're talking over 1 million people in the desert in tents. And they were wandering to who knows where we're going. And they didn't have to trust Moses so much, although they would rebel against God when they would question Moses' ability to lead them. They should have just said, wait a second, God's leading us because there's his cloud. Come on, we don't care what Moses says. There's his cloud. But he led them in the desert in an intimate way. And not just God leading God's leaders, Moses and Aaron, those guys. This is God directly leading the people of Israel. They could see. And when the cloud would lift up, and this pillar of cloud would lift up, they'd say, honey, get the kids. We got to pack up. We're leaving today because God's leaving. We have to follow him. I mean, do you have a more direct ability to be led by God than that? Or you wake up in the morning and you're having your bacon and eggs. Oh, wait. You're having your eggs. No, I don't have to have eggs. I mean, you're waking up in the morning and you're looking up and, honey, are we moving today? Just a second. No, it looks like he's staying put. Looks like, I think we're here today. Yeah, I think we're staying put. Yeah, okay, well, I'll make a bigger breakfast today. So it was an extraordinarily direct way in order for God to communicate with over 1 million people. Over 1 million people that are in the desert. They don't know where they're going. They don't know how life is going to be sustained. They rely on this God, and this is God saying, chill. I'm still here. I'm in your midst. And as long as I'm in your midst, just stay here and everything will be fine. It's a tremendous picture of security, of direction, unambiguous, the presence of God. Wow. I've read this story so many times. I physically have to go back and find a picture of a tornado on the internet so I can remind myself that this presence wasn't just a little in the middle of the desert. This was a direct line connection of a cloud from where our feet trod to where heaven is. It's gigantic. But I'll go one step past that, and I'm supported a little bit in this speculation by other people. The thought is that the pillar of cloud wasn't just a pillar. It was a pillar, like in this picture, it was a pillar, but then it spread out into a regional cloud. And I'll tell you why in just a second. So it's not just some kind of, but it's actually not a mushroom cloud. I know what you're thinking. I'm thinking more like just a tornado-like thing, a hurricane kind of like thing. But then both of those have attendant with them kind of a pancake flat cloud that comes out around it. I'll tell you why in just a second. But this is just an extraordinary direct connection between God. This was God's intimate way of saying to the people, I did call Moses, I did call Aaron, but I want you to follow me directly. I'm living in your midst. You're living in a tent. I'm living in a tent. And you can actually see my presence here. Wow. So this is the perceivable presence of an omnipresent God. Now, this is one of the pictures I pull up a lot. because this just scares me to death when I see this. But well, in fact, there are some people in this picture right down here. There's a motorhome down there. Right? Yeah. There should be a little cloud of dust behind them as they're boogieing out of there is what there should be, but they're just sitting there. Yeah, so what I want to do is I want to make a case for why this particular Emmanuel presence wasn't terrifying like this. It was actually wonderful. It was wonderful. And we need to just dwell on it just for a second because this will become apparent to you really quickly. You've been in a desert. You've been out in a hot, dry place before. One of the nicest things to find when you're out in the desert is something that you go, oh, I needed this. And I'm not talking about an oasis. I'm talking about something else. Here's a picture to help your thinking. Shade, yeah. Shade is a marvelous thing when you're in the desert because the sun's beating down on you, and you're thinking, man, if I can get out of this sun, this would be almost delightful. If I could just get out of the sun, but you look around and there's nowhere to get out of the sun. There's nowhere to get out of the sun. And then on the horizon, a cloud shows up. And you're saying, oh, I hope this cloud comes my direction. Because if this cloud settles over where I am, I can have shade. I don't really even care if it rains. I'll just take the shade. So for a desert living people, the presence of a cloud was a promise of rest and shade. Really good story. So when God says, I'll be with you in the desert, and I'll be a cloud that's with you, people who understand the desert go, a cloud with us? Deal. It's like having your own personal cloud that you lasso, and as you walk around, it just comes with you. It's like a gigantic umbrella. And God says, I will be with you. And so that's why I think, in a real sense, the cloud wasn't just the pillar. The pillar was part of that. It was a connection to that. But it was really like a gigantic shade umbrella in many respects. So when you take 1 million people that are tenting out in the desert, they could sit there and say, outside of the covering of our God is nasty, hot, abysmal life way out there. But here, we're in the shelter of the Almighty. See, this is why shade is a wonderful thing. And we forget about that because we have houses and air conditioning and stuff like that. But if you've ever been out by yourself in a desert, in a dry place, shade is like the best gift in the world. In the world. That's how God wanted to be thought of as he dwelt among them, as someone who brought rest and cover and shade in the middle of a dry and weary land. Hold that thought, because that's just a powerful metaphor. But if you know this story, you know that there's another component to this presence. And it looks like this. It looks like a campfire. So we know that this cloud also at night was bright. It was bright like a gigantic earth to heaven night light. So I put the campfire there because, again, if you're camping, you realize that, without all your 21st century devices like flashlights and stuff like that, a campfire is really the only source of light at night in the camp. And why, besides being able to make s'mores, what's a great thing about campfires when you're camping? Heat. Oh, yes. Well, what if you're in the desert? Well, okay. The light itself is a wonderful thing, right? Because you can see where you're going at night. If you have to go potty or something like that, it tells you how to get there without killing yourself, stuff like that. Or here, let me offer another one. Let me tell you this story, because this is where I really appreciated light in the middle of the night. When Dorothy and I were up in Logan Canyon camping, and just 40 minutes up that direction, we sat on each side of a gigantic campfire. We were at our campsite. Logan River's right next to us. There's nobody else in the campsite, so it's just us. This is a beautiful place. And we have this roaring campfire, maybe, I don't know, twice the size of this one in the picture. So we got this gigantic campfire going. We're sitting in our chairs, our lawn chairs, on each side of the campfire, trying to look through these gigantic flames to see each other and talking. I mean, it was a big campfire. And then Dorothy, as she's looking at me, looks over my right shoulder with this kind of terrified look in her face. And she points over my shoulder and says, "Moose." And as I turned to look over my right shoulder, I saw 2 calves and a cow, moose, running through our campsite behind me. Running through our campsite. And then I went, wow, that's incredible. And as I turned to go face her, as I'm turning to face her on the other side of the fire, I see a gigantic bull, a bull moose. goes running right behind Dorothy's chair. I mean, right behind her. If she had stretched, she would have felt moose fur go past on her. I was that close. It was that close. And this moose wasn't ambling through our campsite. He was running. Now, I mean, we'll put this is our public service announcement. If you see a moose out in the open, don't do anything. They'll charge you, right? They'll charge you. They're aggressive animals. These animals are running through our campsite at top speed, close enough to Dorothy that they could have trampled her on the way through. I still have this. I have this video recorded in my mind. It's kind of blurred because I was turning my head at the time. But as I'm turning, I see moose hide going past her head. That's what I see. I'm not even looking fast enough to see the top of the torso of the animal. I just barely saw his head as he went by because that's how fast he was going. But I still see moose hide going behind Dorothy's head. And then they run off down to a couple campsites down from us. Well, we're just both shocked. I mean, that whole thing I told you, it took a couple minutes to describe, took place in about 10 seconds. Maybe not even that. And then we're sitting there going, that was interesting. And then you start thinking about it. Okay, you start thinking about it. Okay, clearly they weren't charging us because, we would be dead by now. There was 4 moose. They weren't charging us. But they were still running at top speed. Why does a bull moose run away? Predators. And as you make that connection in your head, because the cow is protecting the 2 calves, and the bull moose is kind of doing a diversionary tactic, and he's coming within arm's reach of our fire. That's maybe 5 feet tall. And thinking, predators. So we're sitting there going, well, now, what would scare a bull moose? Mountain lion or bear. So when you make that realization as you're sitting by the campfire, then this, so what do you do? See, this is the whole thing. What do you do? And I kept thinking, well, we got this roaring fire right here. I was told in Boy Scouts to stay with the fire until the last ember died. So, so we kept sitting there. And as I'm sitting there, we're thinking, are we in danger? I mean, if a bull moose is going to run and redirect the entire family away, I mean, should we be out here? And then I saw the fire. I thought, well, would a bear or a mountain lion charge us with this kind of a fire? So I think the decision we made at the moment was we'd stick it out and stay by the fire because that was safer than walking the 20 yards to the trailer. Stay close to the light because the light ends up intimidating the predators. And I think in some kind of 3D chess kind of way, the moose knew that the best way that they could shake the predator was to go through the fire area and the predator wouldn't follow them. I mean, go right to the fire. The bull moose went right to the fire. The only thing separating him was Dorothy's chair. Well, and Dorothy too. Yeah. So here's what's nice about a fire when you're camping or when you're in the middle of a desert and there's a lot of nasty tribes around that don't know who you are and they don't want you to be in their area. This kind of fire can actually be a tremendous protection at night to intimidate the people who might want to attack you and pick you off one at a time. And so the nighttime thing, they could go to bed at night in the desert. They could see this cloud, which now has become a tower of fire. It doesn't just say like night light. It says fire. It says fire. That would be there in the middle of their camp, starting from God's tent and going up, and they were all surrounding it. And so there were nomadic people in the area, tribes that did not like the fact that these over 1 million people were moving into their neighborhood. So there was antagonism there. There's a lot of problems with that. So they could go to bed at night, and they could tell their kids, everything's going to be fine. Because in the morning we'll wake up just fine because look out the tent flap. You see that fire going up to heaven? That's God protecting us. You tuck each other in and you go to sleep and rest. 2 gigantically wonderful things, visibly designed by God to put your heart at rest, to bring you joy in the afternoon heat, to protect you and give you a sense of security at night. And then as you walk through the desert, he led the way. I mean, can you think of a better picture for God with us, Emmanuel? Now, did this protection thing actually work? Well, indeed it did. Let me go back in the passage just a little bit. Because that's not even close to what it probably looked like, but that's my best attempt. So if you go back to where they're trapped at the Red Sea, okay? So don't read that for a second. First, I just want to tell you. So remember when they first left Egypt, they go out and Pharaoh's army decides to let them go. They give them money so they'll get out of their hair because they hate all this kind of stuff. But they journey over to the edge of the Red Sea. It's a dead end. It's a dead end in the desert. And then suddenly when they realize they're at a dead end in the desert, then they say, so you brought us out here to die? There's no graves to bury us in Egypt. You brought us out, you were just out here to die. Moses says, well, now just wait for it. And then right then they realize that Pharaoh's army has changed their mind. They decide to marshal their 600 chariots and come after them and kill them now that they're pinned against the shores of the Red Sea. This is the best slaughter that's ever going to happen, the Egyptians are thinking. And then this happens. Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, led in front, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. So now they're still pinned against the Red Sea. It hasn't parted yet. You don't know that story. You're pinned against the Red Sea. The Pharaoh's army is coming up behind them. And this cloud, this pillar, this presence of God, Emmanuel, God with us, picks up and moves from the front, leading them, to behind them to be between them and the Egyptian army to protect them. That should be a good sign for the Israelis, but they still groused about that because they knew they were all going to die. We're all going to die. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. So that pillar of light, that fire in the cloud, stood between them and the Egyptians. And it says that all night long, there was no contact made militarily because it stood in the gap between them. God understood the weakness of our position. Now, he hadn't parted the Red Sea, but he decided to let that event just wait just a second so he could demonstrate to them that even when threats come from your blind side, when they come up behind you, when you think everything looks fine, after all, they paid us to leave Egypt, and you think you're secure, but then the situation changes suddenly, boom, and all of a sudden you realize we're in great peril, and we didn't think we needed an escape plan because after all, they paid us to get out of town, but now their chariots are coming down on us. We're toast, what's going to happen? And God says, I could part the Red Sea right now, but I got another idea. And so he just picks up and moves behind them and plants right there and causes the Egyptian army to totally freak out. So much so, Moses writes, that one coming near the other didn't happen all night long. There was no contact. Why? Because of the pillar. And this is the very first antagonistic event that happened with Israel as they left Egypt. Now, it happened many times that there were bad people who came after them in the deserts. There were some bad guys who made it their living because they were small, is just to pick off the edges of Israel as they came through the desert. And they were bad dudes. But there was danger out there. But God's presence with this fire saved them from the bull moose because it was there. God with us. Okay, let's quit right here. We're going to make some summary statements. Let's just think about this for a second, because you're saying, well, you're saying Emmanuel, but isn't that term reserved for Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us? Well, yeah, I mean, it comes out of Isaiah 7, and he says something fascinating there that gets quoted again in Matthew about the birth of Jesus, which is this baby that's born is God with us. Now, that's a whole different dimension, but the idea of Emmanuel, God with us, is something that continues to show up in the timeline from the beginning to the end of time. Here we have a creator God who wants to be with his creation, you. He wants to be with you. This is his intention all along. And the heartbreak from God's perspective is that his creation, mankind, stiff-arms God and says, I don't want anything to do with you. But this God still loves the world that he gave his son. He still loves the world. He wants to dwell with them. So Emmanuel it's not just for Christmas. It's a concept of the theme of the Bible of a God who wants us to be with him and him to be with us. Emmanuel, God with us, and in so doing, finding real life in knowing God and living with him. I mean, that's the theme of the Bible from the beginning and end. That's the whole theme. So Emmanuel, when we look at it at Christmas, it is really It's a unique version of all these events that happen. And we'll talk more about that next week. But let me just make some summary statements here, because we saw this in the cloud. I mean, he dwells in the midst of our journey. This is a God who says, regardless of where you're going, I want to go there with you. It's exactly what he's saying to the Israelites, and it's exactly what he's saying to us. No matter where you go, no matter the uncertainty as you step out on the process of where you're going, I want to go with you. I want to be part of this. I want to dwell with you. I want to tent with you where you tent. And this is a God who just doesn't say, get out of town and good luck, I hope things work out. This is a God who says, I want to go with you. So this is a God who's not only intent with living with mankind, but sharing the experiences that men walk through in life. And so you can start extending this, because this is true of God today. I mean, we go through a lot of changes in life, a lot of leavings of Egypt, going off into uncertain directions. We don't know where it's going to lead. It's kind of scary for us. Can God guide you intimately? He did then, and he can today. Will he go with me, or am I going to get in a situation where I think, what am I doing out here? Maybe I should just go back home. I don't know. Is God really with me, or isn't he with me? Is he Emmanuel, or isn't he Emmanuel? Is God with us? And so when you stop and remind yourself, yeah, God is with us. He wants to be on the journey with you. Now, the interesting thing is, he doesn't give these guys, Israel, any, how shall I say this? Any motivational lectures about how nice the land of milk and honey looks. I mean, he doesn't need an enticement, like you have an enticement from, cruises in the ocean. Come with us because we have, he doesn't entice them with the destination, the wonderful things about the destination. But he does tell them that I've prepared that place for you, and we will be there together. And oh, by the way, I'll go with you. So this is also a message theme that shows up in the entire Bible, is God doesn't necessarily motivate you to move and change and go different directions because necessarily of where you're going, or even an assurance of where you're going. But he does motivate us by the assurance that he's going to go with us. And that's a whole different thing. That's a whole different thing. A God who never leaves us nor forsakes us. So God, many times believers will say, well, I became a believer. Now I expect that I am going to go to the land of milk and honey. Isn't that what the Christian life is like? The land of milk and honey? Yeah, okay. Well, there's good and there's bad. And in fact, even in the bad times, and Israel went through some pretty nasty bad times. Even through the bad times, the promise isn't so much the destination. The promise is the journey with the one who loves us. That's what's really a big deal. Because you can enjoy the presence and life of God when things are good, and you can enjoy that when it's bad. And in fact, as I look back on my timeline, I appreciated the character and nature and loving kindness of God more in the hard times than I did in the good times. So good times, bad times, always Emmanuel, God with us. I mean, that's clearly what he's showing here with this cloud thing. Also, you can look at this, and I just think this is wonderful. Everyone experienced the presence of God, not just Moses. Not just Moses. Everyone experienced the presence of God. Does this mean that God wants to dwell in his creation of mankind, and he wants each of us to have an understanding of his presence and his influence on our lives? Yes, each and every single one of us. There is, in the desert with Moses and Aaron, there is no hierarchy. There is no hierarchy in terms of connection with God. They could look out their tent. They could see God. They could see him leading. They could see him protecting them at night. They could see all of it. Every one of them was intimately involved with the presence of God, firsthand experience. So the generations that followed after that, they could say, kids, I want to tell you about what happened while we were out there. The presence of God was cleared and made us sleep well at night because he knew he was protecting us. God is with us, and he's with you. It's an astonishing thing, and it's an experience that all of us can participate in. Also, interestingly enough, this cloud thing is clearly not human, but it's still very personal. Not human, but personal. In terms of what? Well, in terms of direction, in terms of protection and care. And when they get in the desert, in terms of dinner, breakfast, and lunch with the manna. I mean, here's God, in some sense, they came to understand, was not a God who was human in terms of being in the flesh. I mean, it wasn't like incarnation with God being in Moses, but God was still with us, and yet his direction and connection with us was personal. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was personal. for each of us. So this brings us to where we are today as well. You know, God may not be human. In fact, he's spirit. God says the one with the well, God's spirit. And you got to worship him in spirit and truth. But he's spirit. That's different. That's different. We don't know. How do we relate to a being that's a spirit? Well, through Christ and other means, including this cloud, we understand that God is indeed quite personal in his connection with us. But he's not human. So that just changes the dynamic of the relationship. But it's still a relationship. That's what's fascinating about this. Also, the daily direction was extraordinarily practical. There was no ambiguity. You know, are we moving today? You can tell instantly. Kids, go out and see what the cloud's doing. You know, are we moving today? Not moving today. Where are we going? I don't know. We just have to follow the cloud. That's not ambiguous at all. And I mean, that's extraordinarily clear. How long will we be out here? Well, I don't know. But we'll follow him. We're getting to where his promises are going to be. Yeah, well, okay. And lastly, and I just love this, even when we sleep, whether it's day or night, when we're sleeping, God's still in charge. He's still on guard. He's still looking out for you. He's still in your presence. He does not leave. He neither sleeps nor slumbers, is what it says. He's one that even when we are least capable of protecting ourselves, he's at the guard and he's watching. He's with us. 24/7. This is the God who so delights with being with us that he decides to lose sleep and stay up every night just so he can be with us and watch over us. Well, he doesn't lose sleep. But God did rest on the seventh day. Okay, we won't get into that. Does this sound like something in your New Testament experience? Paul wrote about this extensively. All who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. That cloud thing in the desert is kind of like a gigantic metaphor for the Spirit of God in us. What? Now I said Emmanuel is the perceived presence of an omnipresent God. Okay. But do you realize that same God is in you? That's the miracle of the new covenant. Christ in you. So we're talking about that same pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, leading, directing, lifting, moving, living in the midst of your travels. That's the Holy Spirit. That was a way of saying, yeah, God's in your presence. He's not a human, but he is nonetheless personal and intimate and directive and unambiguous in his spirit. So when you turn the corner into the new covenant after the coming of Christ and resurrection, giving your life to him, in the new covenant, as promised in Jeremiah 31, God's not in a pillar of fire anymore. He's in you. He's in you. He's in you. God with us. See, so the Emmanuel concept, which is God's heart, is still operating even when you look in the New Testament and you look in our presence right now. In fact, I'll tell you this. This is something, you'll think I'm silly about this, but I don't care. I'm silly as it is. You know, when I come across hard times, and you come across hard times, it feels kind of like the Egyptians coming up on your backside. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's an event that's usually totally unanticipated. They're always surprises. They're from a direction in your life that you thought things were pretty tidy and taken care of, like they thought as well. They were paid to leave Egypt. And then this thing comes. This thing comes that in your great imagination you can imagine as being the worst calamity ever. And that comes into your experience. You know what I do? I picture in my mind this gigantic pillar of fire. This gigantic pillar of fire. And I say, God, you were a pillar of fire in the desert. And you alone took care of all these blindside attacks and these threats to my existence. And you were always there. God, I need you to be that fire right now. I do that. And I imagine that fire in that pillar. Because if you take that and you map that on something as awe-inspiring as a funnel cloud in a tornado or in a hurricane, and you realize he's even bigger than that. Say, God, I need you to be that. And if it turns out that the problem is not an acute one like that, but more of a chronic one that goes on for a long time, where the results in your life from the problems result in you feeling like you're sitting in the desert without shade on your head. You feel like it's just beating down on you. And tomorrow you wake up and it's beating down on you again. And you wake up the next day and it's beating down on you again. This chronic problem that's not going to kill you today, but eventually it's going to take all of what you have life out of you. I say, God, I need a cloud right now. I need some shade on my head because this has just been going on for so long. I need a cloud. So I come back to this and I say, God, you were a shade to them in a hot and dreary, dry land. I need shade right now. Or God, I have an acute attack coming on the side that I wasn't anticipating. I need you to be a pillar of fire. I need to know that you are taking care of this. I need to know that you have moved from my front to my rear and you're protecting the backside where attacks come. I need to know that you're that fire because you were that fire once. I need you to be that fire now. I go back to this image a lot in both those cases because the God who loves you, who lives inside you, is the God who is the creator and who delights in being with you. And isn't it true that when you're both of those cases where it's a chronic kind of thing or where it's an acute attack, isn't it true that your first temptation from Satan is to say that God is not with me anymore? Isn't that true? I mean, that's the very first thing you hear. He's not with you anymore because if he was with you, you wouldn't be going through this. No. So I have to go back to the cloud and the fire, say, no, he's with me. But I have to remember that. I have to remember that. Because unfortunately, he's not surrounding me with flames of fire or, clouds coming off my head and going up into heaven. I don't have a perceivable presence of this omnipresent God. But I do know by the truth of what I know in the New Testament and Old that he's a God who loves us and wants to be with us. And in the midst of my troubles, he wants to be there. I come to this all the time. So that's Emmanuel. We take Emmanuel as a word and we limit it to the birth of the baby, which is totally fine. I mean, that's the singular use of it in the entirety of the Bible is with the birth of Jesus, both from Isaiah and predicting it and also Matthew quoting it. But you got to understand that the concept of Emmanuel, God with us, is an eternal theme throughout the entire Bible, and it applies to you today. Emmanuel, God with us. Next week, we're going to go to the manger. Well, finally, Jim, how many weeks has it been? Well, that'll be the fourth week on Emmanuel. Finally, we're going to get there because that's the last Sunday before Christmas. So I guess we got to do that. But before we get there next week, I want you to see something fascinating because we've talked all day today about the tent in the desert, the tabernacle in the desert, God's desire to dwell with them, to be with them through this tent. So when John starts his account about who Jesus is, he starts his account in his gospel by saying this. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And the word he used for dwelt is the verb version of the noun tent. What? Yeah. So literally, he said the Word became flesh and he tented with us. God with us, Emmanuel. And just one small, slight note. A tent is a temporary structure, right? It's a temporary house. So even as they were in the desert, it was a temporary presence. And then even with us today, God's presence with us is a temporary one as we live out this life, but it will be permanent in the age to come. But he still tents with you. He's still right there. But you just got to realize this is temporary. Yeah. The Word became flesh and tabernacled with us and tented with us. He said, I want to be with you. Here we go. And that's what he did. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for your great love for us. We thank you that love compels you to be with us.